So philosophy sounds like a boring subject. The dusty one that nobody actually needs. But behind it is a story with executions, exiles, burnt books, bitter rivalries, and ideas so dangerous that governments tried to destroy them. I have spent a long time going through all of it, and what I found is way more dramatic than anyone tells you. Okay, without any delay, let us get into it. Somewhere in Athens, in the spring of 399 BCE, a man is sitting in a stone prison cell surrounded by friends who are weeping, and there is a cup on the table that will kill him before the sun goes down. He is completely calm. His name is Socrates, and what happens in that cell and everything that led to it, and everything that came after, is what tonight is about, because that moment rippled outward across 26 centuries, through Greece and Rome and Persia and medieval Europe and the Enlightenment, and into the world you are lying in right now. The rights you assume you have, the way your doctor is required to speak to you, the logic running inside every computer on Earth, it all connects back to people asking questions and refusing to stop. And this was never just a Western story. While Socrates walked the streets of Athens, philosophers in India and China were asking the same questions under different skies, arriving at answers so different and so deep that the conversation between them still has not ended. Tonight you get the whole thing. 2,600 years of it. You do not need to memorize anything. You do not need to take notes. Just let it wash over you. For philosophy, every question had an answer. Lightning struck because a god was angry. A river flooded because something had been done wrong. Sickness meant spiritual imbalance. Death meant the gods had decided. And the thing is, this was not stupidity. Myth was a technology, maybe the first great technology of the human mind, a way of organizing fear into story and making an indifferent universe feel like it had intentions you could respond to. That is an extraordinary thing to build. But at some point, in multiple places, something shifted. Some human being looked at the lightning, and instead of asking, "What did we do to deserve this?" asked, "What actually causes this?" and refused to accept a divine answer. The shift from mythos, meaning story-based explanation, to logos, meaning reason-based explanation, is where philosophy begins. What is strange is that it happened almost simultaneously in civilizations that had no contact with each other. In Greece, in India, in China, all roughly between 800 and 200 BCE. Philosopher Karl Jaspers called this the axial age, and the fact that it happened independently across the ancient world suggests it was not an accident. It was something the human mind was ready to do. Think about that for a second. The same questions asked simultaneously under completely different skies. The first place it happened, at least in the written record we have, was not Greece. It was India. And it did not begin with a single philosopher. It began with a tradition so old, so vast, and so anonymous that we do not even know who started it. The oldest philosophical tradition we have evidence of did not begin with a single person. It began with a group called the Rishis, poet sages living in the Indus Valley, somewhere around 1500 BCE, 3,500 years ago. We do not know their names. That was intentional. These were not people building legacies. They were people trying to articulate something true, and they passed it forward through pure oral memory. No writing, just human minds carrying human thought across generations with extraordinary precision for centuries before any of it was written down. What they produced was the Rig Veda, one of the oldest texts of any kind on earth, and later, the Upanishads' philosophical commentaries asking what the rituals of Vedic religion actually meant beneath the surface. What they found beneath the surface was radical. They proposed that the individual self, Atman, is not separate from the ultimate ground of all reality, which they called Brahman. The self and the cosmos are, at the deepest level, the same thing. They also proposed karma, meaning the moral weight of action, and samsara, the cycle of rebirth that karma shapes. Think about that for a second. These were ritual specialists, priests, essentially, who looked honestly at their own practice and asked what it was actually pointing toward. And the answer they arrived at reorganized everything. Every meditation app, every yoga class, every mindfulness retreat draws directly from this tradition. concepts of breath, awareness, the quiet observer watching your own thoughts, that is 3,500 years old, and it has never stopped traveling. While this was developing in India, something was stirring on the other side of the ancient world. A merchant in a small Greek trading city would look up from his accounts, stare at the ocean, and ask a question nobody had asked before. His name was Thales, and he lived in Miletus, a busy Greek trading city on the coast of what is now Turkey, sometime around 624 BCE. He was a merchant, a practical man. He worked with numbers, traded goods, understood the sea and the weather in the way that people who depend on both tend to. Then he looked up at the cosmos and asked something nobody had formally asked before. But who made all of this? But what is all of this made of? That is a different question. A fundamentally different question, because the first one accepts that a person is behind it. The second one does not. His answer was water. Everything in the cosmos, Thales proposed, is ultimately water in different forms. Which sounds strange now, but the answer is not the point. The point is the move, the decision to look at the physical world and demand a physical explanation, without gods, without myth, without ritual. Just observation and reason. He called it the archet, meaning the fundamental principle, the underlying substance from which everything emerges. And in doing that, he essentially invented the question that physics has been trying to answer ever since. There is a story about him that has survived 2,500 years. He was walking one night, studying the stars, and fell into a well. A servant girl pulled him out and reportedly told him that he knew so much about the heavens and so little about what was at his feet. He probably deserved that. On May 28th, 5 BCE, Thales predicted a solar eclipse. Correctly, it is the first recorded scientific prediction in human history. That instinct, observe, reason, predict, is the root of the scientific method. It is running inside every laboratory on Earth right now. At almost exactly the same time, Thales was staring at the ocean in Miletus. Two men on the other side of the world were asking a completely different kind of question. Not what is the cosmos made of, but how should a human being actually live? The first was Confucius, Kongfuzi, Chinese, born in 551 BCE in the state of Lu, in what is now eastern China. He was a minor government official who watched the political world around him descend into chaos and corruption, and decided that the problem was moral, not structural. Society was falling apart because people had stopped cultivating virtue. The solution was to rebuild from the inside out. His core concept was benevolence, humaneness, the genuine care for other people that makes civilized life possible. He spent decades wandering between states, teaching, trying to convince rulers to govern with moral seriousness. None of them really listened. He died at 72, disappointed, and then influenced hundreds of millions of people for the next 2,000 years. The second was Laozi, traditionally dated to around 604 BCE, a legendary archivist who, according to the story, grew tired of civilization, climbed onto a water buffalo, and rode toward the western frontier. The border guards stopped him and asked him to write down his wisdom before he disappeared. So he sat down and wrote the Tao Te Ching, 81 short chapters that became one of the most translated books in human history. His answer to how should a human being live was almost the opposite of Confucius. Do not force. Do not strive. Align yourself with the Tao, the natural way of things, and practice Wu Wei, meaning effortless action, moving with reality rather than against it. Two men, two completely different answers, both still shaping the world right now. Around the same time, on the border of what is now India and Nepal, a prince was growing up inside a palace that had been specifically designed to keep him from seeing the world. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. His father was a king who had been told by a prophecy that his son would either become a great ruler or a great holy man, and had decided, reasonably enough, that he preferred the first option. So he built a life around Siddhartha that contained only beauty, comfort, and youth. No sickness, no old age, no death. It did not hold. Siddhartha slipped out of the palace on 4 separate occasions and encountered, in sequence, an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and a wandering monk who looked completely at peace. And something in him broke open. He was 29 years old. He had a wife, a newborn son, everything a person could want. He walked away from all of it.
He spent years practicing extreme asceticism, meaning deliberate self-deprivation, near starvation, trying to find liberation through suffering. It nearly killed him and gave him nothing. So he stopped, sat down under a tree in Bodh Gaya, and stayed there until something shifted. What he arrived at he called the middle way, and he organized it into the Four Noble Truths. Suffering exists, suffering arises from craving, suffering can end, and there is a path to ending it. The Eightfold Path is that path, a practical system of ethical and psychological training that requires no God, no ritual, no faith in anything beyond your own direct experience. This is less a religion than a clinical diagnosis. Here is the problem. Here is the cause. Here is the proof that a cure exists. Here is the treatment. Mindfulness programs in hospitals around the world today are direct applications of this framework, 25 centuries old and still in active use. Back in Greece, the philosophical tradition Thales had started was getting stranger. Two thinkers emerged in the generation after him, and they looked at the same world and arrived at conclusions so opposite that between them they cracked open a debate that has never fully closed. The first was Heraclitus from Ephesus, born around 535 BCE, an aristocrat who despised crowds and lived largely as a hermit. His central claim was that everything flows, pantarei in Greek, that reality is not a fixed thing, but a constant process of change and flux. You cannot step into the same river twice, because the river is always moving and so are you. Beneath all that change, he argued, is logos, an underlying rational principle governing how things unfold. The second was Parmenides from Elea in southern Italy, born around 515 BCE. He looked at the same world and said the opposite. Change is an illusion. Reality is eternal, unchanging, indivisible being. What your senses show you is unreliable. Only reason reveals what is actually true. These two men never directly debated each other, but the argument between them runs through every major philosophical tradition that followed. Is reality fundamentally dynamic or fundamentally stable? Do the senses reveal truth or deceive? Is experience or reason the path to knowledge? Those questions are still open. Physicists arguing about the nature of time are, in a quiet way, still having this argument. What both men agreed on, without ever saying so, was that the world deserved a real explanation. Not a mythological one, a rational one. That agreement mattered more than their disagreement. Everything we have covered so far, the Vedic sages, Thales, Confucius, the Buddha, Heraclitus, Parmenides, all of it was mostly concerned with the cosmos, with what the world is made of, how reality works, what the nature of existence is. Socrates changed the question. He was born in Athens around 470 BCE, the son of a stonemason. He was, by most accounts, physically unremarkable, short, broad-nosed, barefoot in all weather. He wrote nothing. He charged nothing for his teaching. He spent his days wandering the agora, which was the Athenian marketplace and public gathering space, stopping people mid-conversation and asking them to define their terms. What is justice? What is courage? What is virtue? You use these words constantly, but what do they actually mean? His method was simple and devastating. He would ask someone to define a concept they were confident they understood. Then he would ask a follow-up question, then another. Each question using the person's own answers against them, gently, relentlessly, until the entire structure of their certainty collapsed and they were left standing in what the Greeks called aporia, meaning productive puzzlement, the honest admission that you don't actually know what you thought you knew. He called this his gift to Athens. His critics called it something else. The oracle at Delphi had proclaimed him the wisest person in Athens. His explanation for why was characteristically precise. He was the only person in the city who understood the depth of his own ignorance. He compared himself to a gadfly, an irritating insect that lands on a large, comfortable horse and bites it just enough to keep it awake and moving. Athens was the horse, he was the gadfly. The horse eventually swatted him. In 399 BCE, Socrates was put on trial. The charges were asebeia, impiety, meaning disrespect toward the gods, and corrupting the youth of Athens. The jury was 500 Athenian citizens. The vote to convict was 280 to 220. Close, but enough. The penalty was death.
What happened next says everything about who Socrates was. His friends arranged a bribe. The guards were paid. The escape route was ready. All he had to do was leave. He refused. He had spent his entire life arguing that a person must live according to their principles regardless of the cost, and he was not going to abandon that argument on the day it became expensive. In the days before the execution, he sat in his cell and kept doing the only thing he had ever done. He talked, he argued, he asked questions. Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo records those final hours. Socrates working through arguments for the immortality of the soul while his friends wept around him, and he remained, by every account, entirely calm. On the last morning, the cup of hemlock arrived. Hemlock is a poison that works slowly from the feet upward, numbing as it goes. Socrates drank it without hesitation. He walked around until his legs went heavy, then lay down. He pulled a cloth over his face. His last words were a request to a friend to repay a small debt he had forgotten to settle. A cock owed to Asclepius, the god of healing. Even at the end, he was tying up loose ends. He was 70 years old. He died calmly, in the middle of a conversation, having never written a single word. And the young man sitting in that courtroom, watching all of it, a 28-year-old named Plato, would spend the rest of his life trying to make sense of what Athens had just done. Plato was not the person you might expect to become the most influential philosopher in Western history. He was born into a wealthy Athenian family around 427 BCE. He was a wrestler, good enough that he competed at the Isthmian Games, one of the major athletic festivals of ancient Greece. His real name was Aristocles. Plato was a nickname meaning broad-shouldered, given to him by his wrestling coach. He wrote poetry. He had political ambitions. He was, by every indication, headed toward a conventional life of Athenian privilege. Then he met Socrates. And then he watched Socrates die. Those two events rearranged everything. Plato burned his early writings, abandoned his political ambitions, and spent the next several decades building something nobody had built before, a complete philosophical system covering reality, knowledge, ethics, politics, and the nature of the soul, all of it written in the form of dialogues featuring Socrates as the main speaker. Around 307 BCE, he founded the Academy in Athens, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world, which would operate for approximately 900 years until the Roman Emperor Justinian closed it in 529 CE. At the center of his philosophy was the theory of forms. The physical world you perceive, every object, every person, every beautiful thing, is an imperfect copy of a perfect, eternal, abstract original. The form of beauty is more real than any beautiful object. The form of justice is more real than any law. What your senses show you is shadow. What reason can access is the thing itself. His most famous illustration of this was the allegory of the cave prisoners chained in a cave, seeing only shadows on a wall, mistaking those shadows for reality, with no idea that outside the cave, the sun is shining on actual objects. That allegory is 2,400 years old. It has not stopped being relevant for a single day of those 2,400 years. Plato's greatest student arrived at the Academy at the age of 17 and never really left, not for 20 years, until Plato died and the doors of everything that came next swung open. His name was Aristotle. He was born in 384 BCE in Stagira, a small town in northern Greece. His father was the personal physician to the king of Macedon, which meant Aristotle grew up around medicine, around careful observation of the body, around the idea that you learn about living things by studying them directly. That background never left him either. For 20 years, he worked inside Plato's academy. He absorbed everything, and then, quietly, he began to disagree. Plato believed the most real things were abstract, the forms existing in a perfect realm beyond physical experience, accessible only through pure reason. Aristotle looked at that claim and found it unconvincing. If the form of a horse exists separately from all actual horses, he asked, what does it actually explain? The universal qualities we perceive, beauty, justice, form, do not exist beyond things. They exist in things. You find truth not by transcending the world, but by studying it. This was not a minor disagreement. This was a fracture. When Plato died in 347 BCE, Aristotle was passed over to lead the academy. He left Athens, spent time traveling and doing biological fieldwork, classifying approximately 500 animal species along the way, and eventually returned to found his own school, the Lyceum, in 335 BCE. What he built there was extraordinary. He invented formal logic, the syllogism, which is a method of deriving valid conclusions from premises, the backbone of all subsequent rational argument. He wrote foundational texts on ethics, politics, physics, metaphysics, rhetoric, aesthetics, and psychology. He tutored a teenage Alexander the Great. He collected and analyzed 158 different political constitutions. But here's what matters most. The split between Plato and Aristotle, between idealism and empiricism, between abstract reason and direct observation, between the world as it should be and the world as it is, became the central fault line of all subsequent Western thought. Every major intellectual debate for the next 2,400 years can be traced back to this disagreement between these two men in this city. There is a famous painting by Raphael called The School of Athens. Plato stands at the center, pointing upward toward the forms, toward the abstract, toward pure reason. Aristotle stands beside him, pointing downward toward the earth, toward matter, toward experience. That image is not just art. It is a map of everything that comes after. Aristotle died in 322 BCE. 1 year after Alexander the Great. The classical world they had both inhabited, the Athens of city-states and civic philosophy, was fragmenting into something larger, more unstable, and more frightening. And when the world becomes unstable, philosophy turns inward. The question stopped being, what is the ideal city, and became something more personal, something more urgent. How do I stay sane when everything around me is falling apart? Two schools emerged that tried to answer that question, and both of them are still answering it today. The first was founded by Epicurus, born in 341 BCE. He set up a school in a garden in Athens deliberately outside the political center, and taught that the goal of life is ataraxia, meaning tranquility, freedom from anxiety, the quiet absence of pain, not luxury, not pleasure in the way the word is now used. Epicurus himself ate bread and olives and drank water. What he was after was a life simple enough that almost nothing could threaten it, grounded in deep friendship and freedom from fear. The second was Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium around 336 BCE. Zeno was a Phoenician merchant whose ship sank on a voyage to Athens. He washed ashore, walked into a bookshop, read about Socrates, and never went back to merchant life. He taught in a painted porch, a stoa, which is where the name comes from. His central claim was that virtue is the only real good, and that everything outside your own character, wealth, health, reputation cannot touch you unless you allow it to. Stoicism is currently one of the most widely read philosophical traditions in the world. Cognitive behavioral therapy is built on its bones. 7 centuries pass. Rome rises, absorbs Greek philosophy, and then begins to crack. Christianity spreads through the empire, and the question philosophy has to answer changes completely. It is no longer how do I live well, but how do I reconcile reason with faith? The man who built that bridge was Augustine of Hippo, born in 354 CE in what is now Algeria. He was not, in his early life, a saint. He was brilliant, restless, and by his own account, deeply pleasure-seeking. He moved through Manichaeism, a dualist religion that explained evil as a cosmic force equal to good, then through Neoplatonism, before arriving at Christianity in his early 30s through a conversion so sudden and complete that it stopped him in a garden in Milan. He heard a child's voice, or believed he did, saying, "Toll ledge, take up and read." He opened Paul's letters at random, something shifted. He never looked back. What Augustine did philosophically was enormous. He took Plato's framework, the ideal forms, the hierarchy of reality, the soul's yearning for what is permanent and true, and rewired it entirely around the Christian God. The restlessness Plato described as the soul seeking the form of the good became, in Augustine, the soul seeking God. His Confessions, written around 397 CE, is the first true autobiography in Western literature, a ruthlessly honest examination of his own mind and desires. His influence on how Western civilization thinks about guilt, desire, free will, and the interior life is so deep, it is almost invisible. It is just the water most of us swim in. While Western Europe moved through what historians call the early Middle Ages, a period focused more on survival and theological consolidation than speculative thinking, something remarkable was happening elsewhere. In Baghdad, in Sardoba, in Cairo and Persia, Islamic scholars were doing something that would ultimately save the Western philosophical tradition from losing itself entirely. They were translating, studying, debating, and significantly extending the works of Aristotle and the other Greek philosophers' texts that had largely disappeared from Latin Europe. The first figure worth knowing is Avicenna, known in the Islamic world as Ibn Sina, born in 970 CE in what is now Uzbekistan. He had memorized the Quran by age 10. By 18, he was practicing medicine. He wrote the Canon of Medicine, a systematic encyclopedia of medical knowledge that was used in European universities for over 600 years. His philosophical work extended Aristotle's metaphysics into questions about necessary and contingent existence, meaning the difference between things that must exist and things that merely happen to exist, an argument that shaped every subsequent discussion of God's existence in both Islamic and Christian thought. The second is Averroes Ibn Rushd, born in Sardoba in 1126. He wrote detailed commentaries on nearly every work of Aristotle, so thorough and so precise that medieval European scholars simply called him the commentator. His works were banned and burned by both Muslim and Christian authorities at various points, which is usually a reliable sign that someone is saying something important. The Islamic Golden Age translated approximately 2,000 Greek works. Without that transmission, there is no Thomas Aquinas, no European Renaissance, no scientific revolution. That is not a small thing to have done. The Greek texts that Islamic scholars had preserved arrived back in Western Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, and the effect was immediate. Suddenly, theologians had access to Aristotle's complete works and had to figure out what to do with a pagan philosopher who had figured out so much without any help from Christian revelation. Thomas Aquinas decided the answer was to synthesize them. Aquinas was born in 1225 in Italy, the son of a nobleman. His family wanted him to lead a prestigious Benedictine monastery. He joined the Dominicans instead, a mendicant order, meaning they owned nothing and wandered, and his family was so furious they kidnapped him and locked him in a castle for a year. He spent the time studying theology. His classmates called him the dumb ox because he was large and quiet and slow to speak. His teacher, Albertus Magnus, reportedly said the lowing of this ox would one day be heard around the world. He was right. What Aquinas built was the Summa Theologica, an attempt to answer every significant theological and philosophical question through a combination of faith and reason, working together rather than in opposition. He offered 5 rational arguments for God's existence. He argued that reason could take you most of the way to theological truth, and revelation finished the journey. Then came William of Ockham, born around 1287, who took a blade to all of it. His principle, now called Occam's razor, states that among competing explanations, the simplest one that fits the evidence is to be preferred. Do not multiply complexity beyond necessity. That principle is inside every scientific methodology and every AI model selection process running today. By the 17th century, the medieval synthesis was cracking. The printing press had arrived. The Reformation had split Christianity. Copernicus and Galileo had moved the earth out of the center of the cosmos. The world needed a new philosophical foundation, and 3 men across roughly a century and a half built it. The first was René Descartes, born in France in 1596. On the night of November 10, 1619, sheltering in a warm room during a military campaign, He had 3 vivid dreams that he believed revealed his philosophical mission to rebuild all human knowledge on foundations so solid that nothing could shake them. His method was radical doubt. Strip away every belief that could possibly be questioned. What remains? What remained was this: he could not doubt that he was doing the doubting. I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. One certainty is the thinking self. Everything else gets rebuilt from there. The second was John Locke. Born in England in 16, where discarded with the mind, Locke started with experience. The mind at birth is a blank slate, tabula rasa, and everything written on it comes from the senses. His political philosophy followed the same logic. No person is born with the right to rule. All authority must be justified, and individuals possess natural rights to life, liberty, and property that no government can legitimately take away. Thomas Jefferson read Locke carefully. It shows. The third was David Hume, born in Scotland in 1711, and he was the most radical of the 3. He looked at causation, the assumption that one thing makes another thing happen, and argued that we never actually perceive it. We see one billiard ball strike another, we expect the second to move, but the causal connection itself is invisible. It is a habit of mind, not a feature of reality. That observation still has no fully satisfying answer. Hume's skepticism reached a philosopher in the Prussian city of Königsberg, who said it woke him from his dogmatic slumber, the comfortable assumption that reason could simply be trusted without examination. That was Immanuel Kant, born in 1724. He never traveled more than 60 miles from Königsberg his entire life. Neighbors set their clocks by his daily walk, and he wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, arguing that the mind does not passively receive experience, it actively shapes it. Space, time, causality, these are structures the mind imposes on the world, not features it discovers. His ethics were equally precise. Act only on principles you could will everyone to follow. Treat people as ends, never merely as means. After Kant came Hegel, born in 1770, who watched Napoleon ride into Jena and called him the world spirit on horseback. Hegel argued that reality moves through contradiction, thesis against antithesis producing synthesis, an endless process driving history forward toward what he called absolute spirit. After Hegel came Nietzsche, born in 1844, who looked at the entire Western tradition and delivered a diagnosis. God is dead, not a celebration. A warning. The Enlightenment had dissolved the foundations of meaning, and nobody was taking that seriously enough. Thus Spoke Zarathustra sold fewer than 100 copies on publication. The 20th century gave philosophy its hardest test. 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the atom bomb. Every certainty the Enlightenment had promised turned to ash in the span of 50 years. Philosophy responded with its most personal thinking yet. Wittgenstein, born in 1889, argued that most philosophical problems are not real problems. They are language confused about itself. Meaning does not come from words pointing at fixed things in the world. It comes from how words are used in specific contexts between real people. Heidegger, born the same year, asked what it actually means to exist, not as a thinking subject observing the world from outside, but as a being always already thrown into a specific life, a specific time, moving toward death. Sartre, born in 1905, said existence precedes essence. You are not born with a fixed nature or purpose. You exist first. Then you create yourself through your choices. He refused the Nobel Prize in 1964. Rawls, born in 1921, a quiet Harvard professor and World War II veteran, revived political philosophy with a single thought experiment. Imagine designing society without knowing what position you would occupy in it. Would you choose? His book, A Theory of Justice, has been cited over 100,000 times. Okay, that was the history. 2,600 years of it. Now let us actually learn the thing. The simplest and most powerful tool philosophy ever produced was not a theory about reality or a system of ethics. It was a way of having a conversation. Socrates called it elenchus, meaning examination or refutation. We call it the Socratic method, and the way it works is this. You find someone who is confident they know something. You ask them to define it, and then you use their own answers to show them that they do not actually know it as well as they thought. Imagine a detective interviewing a witness who is completely certain about what they saw. The detective does not argue, does not accuse, just keeps asking questions. And how do you know that? And what exactly did you mean by that? And does that still hold if this other thing is true? Until the witness's confident account starts to unravel and something more honest emerges underneath. That is exactly what Socrates was doing on the streets of Athens every single day with everyone he met. Formal definition is this: it is a method of dialogue designed to expose contradictions in a person's stated beliefs, not to humiliate them, but to move both participants toward clearer thinking and more accurate understanding. Here is how it looks in practice. Socrates approaches a general named Laches, a decorated military commander, a man who has spent his entire career in battle, and asks him to define courage. Laches says courage is standing firm in battle. Socrates asks, what about a soldier who retreats tactically to win a larger engagement? Is he not courageous? Laches revises his answer. Socrates finds a problem with the revision. This continues until Laches, who has fought in more battles than most people will ever see, admits he no longer knows what courage actually is. That admission is the point. Socrates called it aporia, productive puzzlement, the honest recognition of your own ignorance. Most people treated it as an ending. Socrates treated it as the only honest place to begin. This matters because every law school using the case method, every scientist submitting work to peer review, every therapist trained in cognitive behavioral therapy is working from the same basic structure. Examine the assumption, find the contradiction, arrive at something more true. The Socratic method is 2,400 years old. It is also the operating procedure of every serious intellectual discipline alive today. Plato watched his teacher die for asking questions, and the question that consumed the rest of his life was this: if Socrates was right, if genuine knowledge is possible, where does it actually come from? Because it clearly does not come from the physical world around us. The physical world is unreliable. Things change, decay, contradict each other, look different depending on the light. You cannot build certain knowledge on something that shifts. So where does it come from? His answer was the theory of forms, and it is one of the strangest and most influential ideas in the history of human thought. Imagine you are in a cave, chained from birth, so you can only face one wall. Behind you, outside the cave, real objects move in sunlight. People, trees, animals, fire. But all you can see are their shadows flickering on the wall in front of you. You grow up believing those shadows are reality. You name them, study them, argue about them. Then someone breaks your chains and drags you toward the entrance. The light is overwhelming. Your eyes burn, but slowly you begin to see the actual objects casting the shadows, and you realize that everything you thought you knew was a pale imitation of what is actually there. That is Plato's allegory of the cave, and it is his description of the human condition. The formal claim is this: for every type of thing or quality that exists in the physical world, there is a corresponding eternal, perfect, abstract original that Plato calls a form. The form of beauty is more real than any beautiful object. The form of justice is more real than any law. The form of the good sits above all other forms, the way the sun sits above the physical world, making everything else visible, giving everything else its reality. Physical things participate imperfectly in their forms. Every circle you have ever drawn is slightly imperfect. Every beautiful object will age and decay. Every just law can be revised. But the form of the circle, the form of beauty, the form of justice, these do not change. They are not located anywhere in physical space. They are not made of matter. They simply are, eternally and perfectly, accessible only through reason. Here is what makes this more than abstract speculation. Think about mathematics. You have never seen a perfect circle. Every circle drawn on paper or rendered on a screen is slightly irregular, and yet you understand what a perfect circle is. You can reason about it calculate with it, prove theorems about it. Where does that understanding come from, if not from experience? Plato's answer is that you are accessing the form, the eternal, perfect original that exists independently of any physical drawing. This is why many mathematicians, even today, quietly hold a Platonic view, the feeling that mathematical truths are discovered rather than invented, that they exist independently of human minds and are simply waiting to be found, and the moral implications are just as significant. If the form of justice exists independently of any human law or cultural preference, then there is a standard against which every law can be measured and found wanting. And justice is not just unpopular or inconvenient. It is a failure to participate in something real. That idea is the philosophical foundation of every human rights argument ever made. Plato gave us a picture of reality. The student Aristotle looked at that picture and asked a more practical question. Given that we live in the physical world, the imperfect, changing, messy physical world, how do we actually become good people inside it? His answer was virtue ethics, and it is probably the most intuitive moral framework ever constructed, because it matches the way most people already think about character, even if they have never heard the term. Imagine you want to become an excellent musician. You could read every book ever written about music theory, study harmony, rhythm, the physics of sound, and understand all of it perfectly. Reading about music will not make you a musician. You become a musician by playing, badly at first, then less badly, then competently. Then, after years of practice, something shifts, the technique becomes invisible, and the playing becomes natural. What you have built is not a skill set, it is a musical character. Virtue works exactly the same way, Aristotle argued. The formal definition is this: virtue ethics holds that moral goodness consists not in following rules or calculating outcomes, but in cultivating stable character traits through repeated practice until acting well becomes second nature. The goal is eudaimonia, a Greek word usually translated as happiness, but meaning something closer to flourishing, thriving, living in full accordance with your deepest capacities. Each virtue, Aristotle argued, sits at the midpoint between two vices. Courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity sits between miserliness and waste. Honesty sits between deception and brutal tactlessness. A virtuous person has practiced these midpoints so consistently that they no longer have to calculate. They simply respond well, because responding well has become who they are. The key concept here is phronesis, practical wisdom, meaning the judgment to know which virtue is required in each specific situation. Rules cannot give you this. A rule book tells you to be honest, but only practical wisdom tells you when honesty requires gentle delivery, when it requires directness, and when silence is the more honest response. Consider what this looks like in practice. A person committed to honesty does not just avoid lying, they have practiced truthfulness so consistently across so many situations that their first instinct in any conversation is to be straight with the person in front of them. They do not have to consult a rule. The character is already there, doing the work. This is why virtue ethics feels different from other moral frameworks. It does not hand you a checklist. It asks who you are becoming through the choices you make every day. In the small moments, nobody is watching. It is the basis of character education in schools. The positive psychology movements focus on human strengths, and the ethical frameworks used in medicine, law, and professional life places where following rules alone has consistently proven not to be enough. There is a question that sits underneath almost every other philosophical debate, and it is this: how do you actually know anything? Not what do you know, but how. What is the source of genuine knowledge, and how much can you trust it? This is the debate between empiricism and rationalism, and it is one of the oldest arguments in philosophy, running from Plato and Aristotle all the way through to modern cognitive science and artificial intelligence. The rationalist position, held by Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza, is that genuine knowledge comes from reason alone. Some ideas are innate, built into the mind, independently of experience, and the clearest example is mathematics. You do not learn that 2 + 2 = 4 by touching objects in the world. You grasp it through pure reason. The mind, on this view, comes pre-equipped with structures that allow it to access truth directly. The empiricist position, held by Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, is the opposite. The mind at birth contains nothing. All knowledge enters through the senses, through sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, and the mind builds its understanding entirely from that raw material. There are no innate ideas. Experience is everything. Imagine two architects arguing about how a building gets built. The first says the blueprint is what makes the building without a design. You just have a pile of material. The second says blueprints are nothing without actual bricks and mortar. The building rises from the ground up, from physical material. The rationalist is the first architect. The empiricist is the second. Then came Kant, and he said something that changed everything. Both of you are right, and both of you are incomplete. Kant's insight, which he called his Copernican revolution in philosophy, was that the mind is neither a blank slate nor a pure reason machine. It comes equipped with innate structures, space, time, causality that are not learned from experience. These structures only generate knowledge when they are applied to sensory experience. Neither alone is sufficient. The materials and the blueprint are both necessary. This matters far beyond academic philosophy. The debate between rationalism and empiricism is alive right now in the question of how artificial intelligence should be built, whether a machine can learn everything it needs from raw data alone, or whether it needs some innate architecture to make sense of that data at all. It is alive in the debate about language acquisition, whether children are born with a built-in capacity for grammar, as Chomsky argued, or whether language is learned entirely from exposure. Hume's specific contribution to this debate remains deeply unsettling. He pointed out that every time you assume the future will resemble the past, every time you expect the sun to rise tomorrow because it has risen every day before, you are making an assumption that cannot be rationally justified. You have never experienced tomorrow. You are extrapolating from habit. That problem, the problem of induction, has never been fully solved. It sits quietly underneath every scientific prediction ever made. Of all the ideas that came out of the empiricist tradition, one has had more direct political and social consequence than almost any other philosophical claim in history. It is Locke's tabula rasa, the blank slate. The claim is this: the human mind at birth contains no innate ideas, no preloaded content, no inborn beliefs or concepts. Everything written on the mind was first delivered through the senses. Experience is the only source. The slate begins empty, and the world writes on it. Imagine a brand new laptop just unboxed. The hard drive is completely empty. No files, no programs, no saved preferences. The hardware itself arrived already installed. The processor, the memory, the keyboard, those came with the machine. Locke's blank slate is about the hard drive, not the hardware. The capacity to learn, to reason, to form language, those capacities are present at birth, but the content, the actual ideas, the concepts, the beliefs, those come entirely from experience. The formal definition is straightforward. Tabula rasa, Latin for scraped tablet. In ancient Rome, wax tablets were scraped clean for reuse. Is Locke's argument that no human being is born with innate ideas. All knowledge is derived from sensory experience and the mind's reflection on that experience. Here is why this is one of the most politically explosive ideas ever proposed. If no person is born with any innate ideas, then no person is born superior to any other. No one is born with a divine right to rule. No one is born destined for servitude. Authority cannot be justified by nature or by God. It must be earned, and it must be justified rationally to the people it governs. That argument flows directly into the American Declaration of Independence, into the concept of universal education, into the entire liberal political tradition of equality of opportunity. Jefferson read Locke carefully. The Declaration reads like a summary of his political philosophy. The blank slate has its critics. Behavioral genetics has shown that roughly half of the variation in most human traits, personality, intelligence, temperament, is heritable, meaning it comes from biology, not environment. Steven Pinker's book, The blank slate laid out this case in detail. The strongest version of Locke's claim is empirically difficult to defend. The weaker version, that environment shapes us profoundly, that no person's destiny is fixed at birth, that education and circumstance matter enormously, that version has never been seriously threatened, and it remains the philosophical foundation of every system that believes human beings can be improved by improving the conditions they live in. Utilitarianism says look at the consequences, count the outcomes, maximize the total well-being. It is a powerful framework and an intuitive one. But one philosopher looked at it and said, you have the whole thing backwards. What makes an action right or wrong is not what it produces. It is what principle it embodies. That philosopher was Kant, and what he built was deontological ethics from the Greek deon, meaning duty, the position that morality is about principles, not outcomes, and that some actions are simply wrong, regardless of what consequences they produce. The central tool was the categorical imperative. Categorical meaning unconditional, not do this if you want that outcome, but do this, full stop, because reason demands it. And it comes in two formulations that are worth sitting with separately. First, act only according to principles that you could will to become universal laws. Before you do something, ask, what if everyone did this? Not just some people, everyone. If the principle behind your action cannot be universalized without contradiction or collapse, then the action is wrong. Imagine a traffic system. You want everyone to follow the rules of the road, not because following them always produces the best outcome in every individual case, but because a system where everyone follows consistent rules allows the whole thing to function. The question you ask is, what if everybody did this? If every driver ran red lights whenever they felt like it, the system collapses entirely. That universal test is exactly Kant's first formulation, applied to every moral choice you make. The lying example makes this sharp. Kant asks, what if everyone lied whenever it was convenient? The result? Language itself would become meaningless. One would believe anyone. Sincere assertion would disappear as a concept, and lying would become impossible because the whole framework of trust that makes deception possible would have dissolved. The maxim of lying cannot be universalized without self-contradiction. Therefore, Kant argues, lying is categorically wrong. Most people disagree with that conclusion. Even many Kantians do. The structure of the argument is what matters. The move from universal principle to moral obligation, bypassing consequences entirely. The second formulation is perhaps even more powerful. Always treat rational beings, persons, as ends in themselves, never merely as means. A person is not a tool, not an instrument for your purposes, not a resource to be optimized. Every person carries a dignity that cannot be traded away, not even for good outcomes. This is the formulation that makes Kantian ethics the philosophical backbone of human rights. We say that torture is wrong even if it would save lives, that slavery is wrong even if it benefited the majority, that experimenting on people without their consent is wrong, regardless of the medical knowledge gained. Those are Kantian arguments. The person is not a means. The person is the point. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, is Kantian in its bones. Every article rests on the assumption that persons have inherent dignity that no authority can legitimately override. Kant died 150 years before it was written, and his fingerprints are on every page. By the middle of the 20th century, philosophy had lived through 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the atom bomb, and the slow collapse of every certainty the Enlightenment had promised. The question was no longer abstract. It was immediate, personal, urgent. If God is dead, as Nietzsche had diagnosed, if history is not moving toward justice, as 2 world wars had demonstrated, if reason alone cannot save us, as the 20th century had proven in the most violent way possible, then what? What are we left with? What is the foundation? The existentialists said, you are. Your choices are. The only foundation available is the one you build yourself through how you live. The central claim belongs to Sartre, and it is this: Existence precedes essence. Every other object in the world has its essence determined before it exists. A chair is designed with a purpose before a single piece of wood is cut. A knife is made to cut before it is forged. But a human being arrives in the world first with no blueprint, no predetermined purpose, no fixed nature. You exist. And then, through every choice you make, you define what you are. Imagine being thrown into a room with no instructions and told to decide what this room is for. You did not choose the room. You did not choose its dimensions or its contents. But everything that happens inside it from this point forward is your responsibility. That is Sartre's picture of human existence. You are thrown into a specific body, a specific time, a specific culture, none of which you chose. And then you are radically, completely, inescapably free to decide what to do with it. That freedom sounds like a gift. Sartre was clear that it is also a weight. He called the refusal to acknowledge it bad faith, mauvaise foi, the ways we lie to ourselves about our own freedom. The person who says, I had no choice. The person who hides so completely inside a role, the dutiful employee, the obedient child, the good soldier, that they forget they are also a free person who chose that role and could choose otherwise. Bad faith is not weakness. It is tempting precisely because freedom is terrifying. If you are entirely responsible for who you are, there is nowhere to hide. Simone de Beauvoir extended this directly to gender. One is not born a woman, she wrote. One becomes one. Qualities, roles, and limitations assigned to women are not natural facts. They are social constructions that have been mistaken for nature. Existence precedes essence applies not just to individuals, but to the categories societies impose on them.
And then there is Camus, who asked the question underneath all of this. If the universe offers no inherent meaning, if there is no God, no historical progress, no rational foundation, does life have any point at all? His answer was not despair, it was rebellion. You create meaning in full knowledge that the universe will not confirm it. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, the man condemned to roll his boulder up the hill forever, who owns his task completely and refuses to be broken by it. Existentialism became the philosophical DNA of the modern self. The vocabulary of authenticity, personal responsibility, owning your choices, all of it flows from here. There is a philosopher who looked at the entire tradition we have been building through this conversation, all the metaphysics, all the epistemology, all the grand theories about the nature of reality and knowledge and the good life, and said quietly but with complete conviction that most of it is not wrong. It is confused. And the confusion is about language. That philosopher was Ludwig Wittgenstein, and he is one of the strangest and most compelling figures in the history of philosophy. He was born in Vienna in 1889 into one of the wealthiest families in Europe. He served in the First World War, gave away his entire inherited fortune, worked for years as a village school teacher, and spent the rest of his life dismantling and rebuilding his own philosophical ideas with a rigor that exhausted everyone around him. The Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, published in 1921, was the only book he published in his lifetime. He later concluded it was fundamentally wrong and spent the rest of his life writing what would become the Philosophical Investigations, published after his death. The early Wittgenstein believed language works by picturing reality. Words and sentences map onto facts in the world the way a photograph maps onto a scene. The later Wittgenstein looked at this and said, "That is not how language actually works at all. Consider the word game. You feel completely confident you know what a game is, but try to define it precisely enough to include every case. Board games, card games, sports, Ring Around the Rosie, war games, solitaire. What single property do all of these share?" Wittgenstein's answer is that they don't share one property. They share a web of overlapping similarities, what he called family resemblances, like how members of a family look alike without any single feature appearing in every face. Words don't get their meaning by pointing at fixed objects or ideas. They get their meaning from the role they play in specific social practices, what Wittgenstein called language games. Just as a chess piece has no meaning outside the rules of chess, a word has no meaning outside the practice in which it is being used. This sounds abstract until you see how much it explains. Take the word pain. In a doctor's office, pain is a symptom to be located and measured. In a conversation with a friend, Pain is something to be expressed and witnessed. In a philosophy seminar, pain is a case study in the problem of other minds. Same word, completely different games. And when philosophers argue about pain as if it has one fixed meaning across all these contexts, they generate confusion that looks like a deep problem, but is actually a linguistic one. Wittgenstein's target was the philosophical tradition's habit of taking words out of their home context and then being puzzled by the strange behavior that results. Philosophy, he argued, should dissolve these confusions rather than build theories on top of them. This is directly relevant to artificial intelligence. Large language models predict words in context, meaning as use, not meaning as fixed reference. Wittgenstein described how language actually works decades before the technology existed to build machines that operate on exactly that principle. There is a question that philosophy had been circling for centuries without quite landing on directly. Not what is real, not what can we know, not how should we live, but what is it actually like to be a conscious being in a world? What is the basic structure of experience itself before any theory is applied to it? That question is what phenomenology tries to answer. The word comes from the Greek phenomenon, meaning that which appears, and the field was founded by Edmund Husserl in the early 20th century. His instruction was simple and radical at the same time. Go back to the things themselves. Describe experience exactly as it presents itself, before you layer any scientific or philosophical interpretation over it. His student Martin Heidegger took this and went somewhere Husserl hadn't intended. Heidegger's central argument is that philosophy has been asking its questions from the wrong starting point. Since Descartes, the assumption has been that the basic unit of reality is a thinking subject, a mind, looking out at a world of objects. Heidegger said that picture is already too late. Before you are a subject observing objects, you are always already in a world, embedded in practices and relationships and concerns, moving through a life that is already underway. He called this Dasein, German for being there, and it is his term for the kind of being that humans are. Not a mind and a body, a being in the world. Here is what that distinction feels like in practice. Right now, wherever you are lying in the dark. Think about everything surrounding you. The pillow, the blanket, the room itself. You are not thinking about these things. They are just there, available, part of the background of your existence. They are what Heidegger calls ready to hand, transparent, functioning, not objects of attention, but extensions of your situation. Now imagine something breaks, a strange sound, a discomfort. Suddenly that seamless background snaps into focus and becomes an object of attention, present at hand, a thing you are now consciously examining. Heidegger's insight is that this second mode, the detached observation of objects, is what philosophy and science have almost exclusively studied. But the first mode, absorbed, caring, unreflective engagement with a world that already matters to you, is actually more fundamental. It is where most of life is actually lived. He also introduced the concept of thrownness, Geworfenheit, the idea that you find yourself already in a situation you did not choose. This body, this time, this language, this culture, you did not select them, you were thrown into them. Authenticity, for Heidegger, means owning your thrown situation honestly, rather than fleeing from it into distraction and conformity. And then there is being toward death. Your own death, Heidegger argued, is the one thing that cannot be delegated or shared or avoided. Confronting it honestly, not morbidly, but clearly, is what pulls you out of the comfortable drift of everyday life and forces the question of what actually matters to you. Phenomenology changed how we think about medicine, design, and technology. Good user experience design is applied phenomenology. It asks what the experience is actually like from the inside in the flow of real use before any technical specification is written. Everything we have covered in this act, the Socratic method, the theory of forms, virtue ethics, the categorical imperative, existentialism, language games, phenomenology, all of it operates with a shared assumption underneath it, even when the thinkers disagree violently about everything else. The assumption is that careful, honest thinking can get you closer to truth. That philosophy done well makes progress. In the second half of the 20th century, a group of mostly French philosophers looked at that assumption and pulled at it. The central figure is Jacques Derrida. Born in Algeria in 1930, he arrived in Paris and began doing something to philosophical texts that made some readers feel liberated and others feel like the floor had been removed. He He called it deconstruction. The basic move is this: every text, every concept, every system of thought is built on binary oppositions: speech over writing, reason over emotion, presence over absence, nature over culture. One term in each pair is privileged, treated as primary, closer to truth. The other is treated as secondary, derivative, suspect. Deconstruction doesn't just reverse these hierarchies. It shows that both terms depend on each other, that neither can be primary, that the stable meaning the text claims to have is always undermined by tensions running through it. Imagine taking apart a building beam by beam, not to destroy it, but to examine every choice made in its construction. Which materials were chosen and which were rejected, whose preferences are embedded in the design, what assumptions were treated as natural that were actually decisions. Deconstruction does this to ideas. Michel Foucault extended this into a different territory. His argument was that knowledge and power are never separate. What counts as truth, what counts as sanity, what counts as normal, these are not neutral discoveries. They are produced by institutions, shaped by those who have authority, and used to define who belongs and who doesn't. His histories of prisons, hospitals, and sexuality were not just historical studies. They were arguments about how power writes the rules of what gets called knowledge. The common misreading of postmodernism is that it claims nothing is true. That is not what it claims. What it claims is that truth is never from nowhere. Every claim to knowledge is made from a specific position, in a specific historical moment, shaped by specific interests and assumptions. Acknowledging this is not nihilism. It is intellectual honesty.
The obvious counter is this: if all truth claims are situated, is that claim itself situated? The self-refutation objection is real, and postmodernists have responses to it, though not everyone finds those responses satisfying. Postmodernism produced, whatever its limitations, were the analytical tools now used in feminist philosophy, post-colonial theory, and critical race theory frameworks that examine whose knowledge counts, whose experience is centered, and whose is systematically excluded. Okay, that was the concepts. From Socrates' questions to Derrida's deconstructions, the entire architecture of philosophical thought. Let us see what all of it actually does in the world you live in every day. There is a version of philosophy that lives in universities, in dense academic journals, in arguments about arguments. That version exists, but it is not the whole story, and it is not the most important part. The more important part is this: every major institution in the world you actually inhabit was built on philosophical foundations. The hospital you would go to if you were sick, the court that would hear your case if you were wronged, the government that claims authority over your life, the algorithms making decisions about you right now. All of it rests on ideas developed by people we have already met in this conversation. Philosophy is not the decoration on top of civilization. It is the load-bearing structure underneath it. The connection is usually invisible, which is part of why it gets missed. Nobody walks into a courtroom thinking about John Locke. Nobody opens a meditation app thinking about the Upanishads. Nobody reads a terms of service agreement thinking about Kant. But Locke is in the courtroom. The Upanishads are in the app. Kant is in the terms of service, or at least he should be. Over 10,000 philosophy papers are published every year. Philosophy majors consistently score in the top bracket on the LSA and GRE, outperforming almost every other field of study. This is not a coincidence. It reflects what philosophical training actually produces: the ability to identify assumptions, construct arguments, and find the flaw in reasoning that everyone else has accepted without examination. What follows is a survey of where the ideas actually live: medicine, law, technology, economics, politics, psychology, the environment, art, and a few places you probably would not expect. Every time a doctor sits down with a patient and explains a diagnosis, lays out the treatment options, and waits for the patient to decide, that interaction is philosophical. Specifically, it is Kantian. The patient is being treated as a rational agent, an end in themselves, someone whose autonomous choice about their own body cannot be overridden by the physician's judgment about what is best. That principle, informed consent, did not come from medical training. It came from philosophy. and it was not always standard practice. The history of medicine is full of cases where patients were treated as subjects rather than persons, where doctors decided what was best and simply proceeded, where entire populations were experimented on without knowledge or agreement. The Tuskegee syphilis study, the Nazi medical experiments, philosophical response to these, the Nuremberg Code of 1947, the Belmont Report, the entire field of bioethics is Kantian in its bones. You do not use a person as a means, not even for good outcomes, not even for science. Bioethics as a formal field emerged in the 1970s, built on 4 principles developed by philosophers Tom Beauchamp and James Childress: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Respect the patient's choices, act in their benefit, do no harm, distribute care fairly. These are not medical discoveries. They are philosophical positions, formalized for clinical use. The harder cases are where the frameworks come into tension. Who gets the last ventilator when there are 2 patients who need it? Do we have obligations to future patients that limit what we offer current ones? Should an elderly patient's wish to refuse treatment override a family's wish to continue it? These are not technical questions. They are philosophical ones, and they are being answered in real time, in real hospitals every day. Peter Singer's utilitarian framework enters here too, and generates enormous controversy. If what matters morally is the reduction of suffering, then the suffering of animals in medical research counts. The suffering of severely disabled newborns counts. These conclusions are uncomfortable. They are also the result of applying a consistent philosophical framework without flinching, which is exactly what Singer does, and exactly why his work provokes the reactions it does. The device you are listening to this on, whatever it is, runs on logic. Binary logic, a system of true and false, 1 and 0, and or and not, cascading through billions of operations per second to produce everything you see on a screen. That logic was not invented by an engineer. It was invented by a philosopher. Aristotle developed formal logic, the syllogism, the rules governing valid inference, in the 4th century BCE. For 2,000 years, it lived almost exclusively in philosophy departments. Then, in 1847, a mathematician named George Boole published a work showing that Aristotelian logical operations could be expressed algebraically. Boolean algebra, as it became known, is the direct mathematical ancestor of every digital circuit ever built. The AND gate, the OR gate, the NOT gate, these are Aristotle's logical connectives, translated into electrical signals. That lineage is worth sitting with for a second. Aristotle classified animals and wrote about virtue and tutored Alexander the Great. He also, as a side project, built the intellectual foundation of the device in your hand. The philosophy of language contributed equally. Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell developed formal symbolic logic and the theory of reference, how words and symbols connect to the things they represent, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This work became the foundation of programming languages, formal semantics, and the entire theory of computation. Then there is Alan Turing, who in 1950 published a paper called Computing Machinery and Intelligence, which opened with the question, can machines think? He proposed what we now call the Turing test as a way of operationalizing that question. It is a philosophical thought experiment dressed as a technical proposal, the question of what thinking actually is, what understanding requires, whether a system can be intelligent without being conscious. These are philosophical questions that computer science inherited and has never fully answered. John Searle's Chinese room argument, published in 1980, made this sharp. Imagine a person locked in a room, following rules to manipulate Chinese symbols they do not understand, producing outputs that look like fluent Chinese to someone outside. The room passes the Turing test, but nobody inside understands Chinese. Syntax, Searle argued, is not sufficient for semantics. Processing symbols is not the same as understanding them. That argument is more relevant now than when it was written. The question Searle raised in the Chinese room argument, whether a system processing symbols actually understands anything, has moved from the philosophy seminar into the center of one of the most consequential debates of our time. because now we have systems that process symbols at a scale and sophistication that nobody in 1980 could have imagined. And the question of whether they have anything like understanding, experience, or moral status is no longer purely academic. Start with consciousness. David Chalmers in 1995 drew a distinction that clarified the whole problem. There are what he called the easy problems of consciousness, explaining attention, memory, learning, the integration of information, which are difficult scientific problems, but in principle solvable through neuroscience and cognitive science. And then there is the hard problem, why any of this processing is accompanied by subjective experience at all. Why is there something it is like to be you, reading this in the dark, rather than just information being processed in silence? The hard problem has no agreed solution, and it matters for AI because if we do not know what generates consciousness in biological systems, we have no reliable way to determine whether we have generated it in artificial ones. Philosophical positions map onto the debate directly. If functionalism is correct, the view that what matters is the functional organization of a system, not what it is made of, then a sufficiently complex AI could in principle be conscious. If Searle is right, then no amount of symbol processing produces genuine understanding, regardless of complexity. If panpsychism is correct, the view that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality present at every level, then the question is not whether AI is conscious, but how conscious. These are not settled questions. They are live debates among serious philosophers and scientists right now, and the moral stakes follow directly. The system can suffer if there is something it is like to be that system, and that something can be painful, then we have obligations toward it. The criteria philosophy has developed for moral consideration become urgently practical. Kant's framework asks whether the system is a rational agent. Singer's asks whether it can suffer. Aristotle's asks whether it has something like flourishing or its deprivation. Nobody has clean answers. The questions are arriving faster than the frameworks can keep up. Economics presents itself as a science. Models, data, predictions, equations. But underneath every economic model is a set of philosophical assumptions about human nature, about what counts as value, about what a good society looks like. And those assumptions were put there by philosophers before the economists arrived. Adam Smith is remembered as the father of modern economics. What is less remembered is that he was a moral philosopher first. His first major work was The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759, 17 years before The Wealth of Nations. The invisible hand, the idea that individuals pursuing their own interests can produce collective benefit without intending to, was not primarily an economic observation. It was a philosophical claim about human nature and social order, rooted in his thinking about sympathy and moral judgment. David Hume contributed something equally foundational: the skepticism about rational self-knowledge, the idea that we do not have clear, reliable access to our own motivations and preferences anticipates behavioral economics by 2 centuries. When Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky demonstrated in the 1970s that humans are systematically irrational in predictable ways, they were providing empirical confirmation of what Hume had argued philosophically. Rawls enters through the question of distribution. His veil of ignorance thought experiment. Imagine designing the economic system without knowing what position you would occupy within it. Produces a specific answer. You would choose a system that protects the worst off members because you might be one of them. This is the philosophical justification for progressive taxation, social safety nets, and the welfare state. And Amartya Sen reframed the entire question of what economics is measuring. Gross domestic product, he argued, is a poor proxy for human welfare. What matters is what people are actually able to do and be, their capabilities. This capabilities approach now shapes the United Nations Human Development Index, the most widely used alternative to GDP for measuring how well a society is actually functioning. Every government that has ever existed rests on a philosophical theory, whether it knows it or not. A theory about human nature, about where authority comes from, about what rulers owe the people they govern and what people owe each other. The tradition that most directly shaped modern democratic governance is social contract theory. core idea is this: political authority is not natural, not divine, not simply the result of whoever is strongest. It is legitimate only when it can be justified to the people it governs, as if they had agreed to it. Thomas Hobbes laid the foundation in 1651, writing during the chaos of the English Civil War. Without government, he argued, human life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, in short, a war of all against all. The social contract is the agreement to surrender some freedom to a sovereign power in exchange for security and order. Hobbes's sovereign is strong, almost absolute. The justification for that strength is still the consent and benefit of the governed. Locke softened this considerably. Government exists to protect natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and when it fails to do that, the people have the right to replace it. That argument is in the American Declaration of Independence, almost verbatim. Rousseau added the general will, the idea that legitimate law expresses not just the sum of individual preferences, but the genuine common interest of the community as a whole. And Rawls brought all of this into the 20th century with a single thought experiment. Imagine you are designing the basic structure of society from behind a veil of ignorance. You do not know your race, class, sex, or natural abilities. What principles would you choose? His answer: equal basic liberties for all, and inequalities permitted only when they benefit the least advantaged members of society. That framework shapes every serious contemporary debate about justice, policy, and what democratic governments actually owe their citizens. The most widely practiced form of psychotherapy in the world today is cognitive behavioral therapy. It works by identifying automatic thoughts, the immediate, unexamined interpretations your mind produces in response to events, and subjecting them to scrutiny. Is this thought accurate? What evidence supports it? What evidence contradicts it? Is there another way to interpret this situation? That is the Socratic method, applied to the inside of your own mind. The connection is not accidental. Aaron Beck, who developed cognitive behavioral therapy in the 1960s, was explicit about the influence. The assumption underlying the entire approach is that suffering is often produced not by events themselves, but by the interpretations we place on them, and that those interpretations can be examined, questioned, and revised. Epictetus said exactly this in the 1st century CE. He was a formerly enslaved Stoic philosopher who taught that it is not things that disturb us, but our judgments about things. That sentence is essentially the thesis statement of cognitive behavioral therapy, written 1900 years before Beck formalized the treatment. Stoic philosophy runs through the entire tradition. The dichotomy of control, distinguishing between what is within your power and what is not, and releasing attachment to the latter, is now standard in sports psychology, executive coaching, and stress management programs worldwide. Existentialist therapy takes a different approach. Irvin Yalom, drawing directly on Heidegger, Sartre, and Camus, argues that the deepest sources of psychological suffering are existential, confronting mortality, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. Therapy, on this view, is not primarily about correcting distorted thinking. It is about helping a person face the fundamental conditions of their existence with honesty and courage. And the third wave of cognitive therapies, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, draw explicitly from Buddhist philosophy. The instruction to observe your thoughts without identifying with them is 25 centuries old. Every decision made inside a classroom rests on philosophical assumptions that rarely get examined. What is knowledge? What does it mean to learn something? What is education actually for? Is it the transmission of information, the development of character, the cultivation of critical thinking, or the preparation of citizens for democratic life? These are not administrative questions. They are philosophical ones, and the answers determine everything from curriculum design to how a teacher speaks to a student. Plato's answer was that education is the turning of the soul toward truth, a gradual reorientation away from the shadows of the cave and toward the light outside it. The goal is not useful knowledge, but genuine understanding, and it requires the student to be actively engaged rather than passively filled. Aristotle's answer was more practical. Education develops the virtues, the stable character traits that allow a person to live well and contribute to their community. You do not teach virtue by lecturing about it. You cultivate it through practice, habit, and the careful guidance of a teacher who embodies it. John Dewey, the American philosopher born in 1859, brought these threads into the modern era. Education, he argued, should be experiential and democratic, rooted in real problems, real inquiry, real collaboration. This influence on progressive education is enormous and still contested, which is itself a sign that the philosophical questions underneath it remain genuinely open. The Socratic Seminar, a discussion format used in secondary schools worldwide, where students question each other's reasoning rather than simply receiving answers from a teacher, is direct applied Socrates 2,400 years later. Confucian philosophy shapes educational culture across East Asia. The emphasis on effort over innate talent, on moral cultivation alongside academic achievement, on the relationship between teacher and student as itself a form of ethical practice. A branch of philosophy concerned with art and beauty is called aesthetics, and it is older than any museum or art school on earth. The questions it asks are ones every person encounters but rarely examines directly. What makes something beautiful? Is beauty in the object or in the perceiver? What separates art from non-art? Does any of this matter morally? Plato's position was deeply ambivalent. Art, he argued, is imitation of imitation. A painting of a chair is a copy of a physical chair, which is itself an imperfect copy of the form of chair. Art is therefore twice removed from reality, and worse, it appeals to emotion rather than reason, which makes it potentially dangerous. In the Republic, he proposed restricting which art forms would be permitted in the ideal city. He was not being casual about this. He genuinely believed that the stories a culture tells shape the character of its citizens. Aristotle disagreed, as he so often did. His Poetics argued that tragedy serves a genuine human need. It produces catharsis, meaning the purging or clarification of pity and fear through controlled emotional experience. Art does not mislead us. At its best, it gives us access to something true about human experience that plain description cannot reach. Kant's contribution was to ask why aesthetic judgment feels objective even though it is subjective. When you say something is beautiful, you are not just reporting a personal preference, you are making a claim that seems to invite agreement, as if beauty were a feature of the object rather than a response in you. Kant called this purposiveness without purpose, the experience of something seeming to fit together perfectly without any particular function. The tension between the felt objectivity of beauty and its apparent subjectivity is the question every art critic, every curator, every person arguing about whether something counts as art is navigating, whether they know it or not. For most of philosophical history, the natural world was treated as a backdrop, the setting in which human beings worked out their moral dramas, not a participant in those dramas with any standing of its own. Nature was there to be understood, used, cultivated, or admired. The question of what we owe it, if anything, barely arose. That changed in the 20th century, and philosophy was central to the change. The first major shift came from Aldo Leopold, an American ecologist and philosopher who published a Sand County Almanac in 1949. His land ethic proposed something simple and radical. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, and wrong when it tends otherwise. This extended moral consideration beyond individual animals and beyond humans entirely, to ecosystems, species, and the web of relationships that sustains life. Peter Singer arrived from a different direction. Suffering matters morally, and sentient animals can suffer. Then the suffering of animals in factory farms and research laboratories is a moral catastrophe by the same logic that makes human suffering a moral catastrophe. The argument requires no special love of nature, just the consistent application of utilitarian principles across species lines. Rawls contributed the framework of intergenerational justice, a veil of ignorance applied across time rather than just across social positions, asks, what obligations do we have to people who do not yet exist? If you did not know which generation you would be born into, What level of environmental degradation would you accept? The answer that follows is one of the strongest philosophical justifications for climate action available. The German philosopher Hans Jonas went further still. Writing in the shadow of nuclear weapons, he argued that the possibility of catastrophic, irreversible harm to future life creates an obligation of restraint in the present that overrides almost everything else. This one tends to surprise people, but the objects you interact with every day, your phone, your kettle, the chair you sit in, the app you opened this morning, were shaped by philosophical ideas, whether their designers knew it or not. The most direct line runs from Taoist philosophy to modern product design. Effortless action, the principle of moving with things rather than forcing them, is the philosophical ancestor of the design ideal that technology should disappear into use. The best tool is the one you stop noticing. The best interface is the one that requires no thought. Steve Jobs spoke openly about the influence of Zen Buddhism on Apple's aesthetic, the commitment to simplicity, to removing everything that is not necessary, to letting the object do exactly what it needs to do and nothing else. Bayer Rams, the German industrial designer, whose work shaped everything from Braun appliances to the visual language of the iPhone, built his 10 principles of good design around a core conviction: good design is as little design as possible. That is Wu Wei translated into product philosophy. Phenomenology enters through user experience design, the discipline of UX, asking what an interaction actually feels like from the inside, in the flow of real use, before any technical specification is written, is applied Heidegger. That starts from the ready to hand, from the experience of absorbed engagement, and asks what would break that engagement and what would deepen it. And Stoicism appears in the apps explicitly built around it. Calm, Headspace, Waking Up, these are commercial products built on the philosophical frameworks of Stoicism and Buddhism, packaged for a population that is, often without knowing it, reaching for exactly what Epictetus and the Buddha were offering. Sports looks like the last place you would find philosophy, but the entire ethical framework of athletic competition rests on ideas we have already covered. The ancient Greek concept of arete, excellence, the full realization of a thing's highest capacities, was not originally a moral concept, it was an athletic one. The Greeks did not separate physical excellence from moral excellence. To compete well, to push yourself to your genuine limit, to win without cheating and lose without bitterness, this was virtue expressed through the body. The Olympic ideal was Aristotelian before Aristotle formalized it. Stoicism is now explicitly taught in elite sports psychology. The dichotomy of control, you control your effort, your preparation, your attitude, and nothing else, is the philosophical foundation of every mental performance coach working with professional athletes today. You cannot control whether you win. You can control how completely you compete. That distinction, which Epictetus articulated in the 1st century, is now standard coaching language. Virtue ethics shapes how we think about sportsmanship. Fair play is not just rule following, it is a character disposition, a stable orientation toward the game and toward your opponent that persists even when breaking the rules would be easy and undetected. It is the Aristotelian mean between reckless aggression and cowardly withdrawal. Doping raises a genuinely philosophical question that rule books alone cannot answer. If the goal of sport is the expression of human excellence, does chemical enhancement undermine that expression or extend it? Where is the line between training, nutrition, recovery technology, and enhancement, and who decides which side of it is authentic? These are not administrative questions. They are questions about what sport is actually for. Space exploration seems like a purely technical enterprise. Rockets, orbital mechanics, life support systems. The further humans go from Earth, the more urgently philosophical questions arise, and some of them have no technical answer at all. The overview effect is the name given to a perceptual shift reported by astronauts who have seen Earth from orbit. The borders disappear. The atmosphere looks impossibly thin. The planet appears small, fragile, and unified in a way that no photograph quite captures. Astronauts consistently report that the experience reorganizes something fundamental in how they think about nationality, conflict, human priorities. That experience has a philosophical name: The Stoics called it the view from above. Marcus Aurelius wrote about imagining the earth from a great distance as a way of dissolving the apparent importance of political conflict and personal grievance. The overview effect is Stoic cosmopolitanism, delivered by rocket. Hence, ethics enter through planetary protection. NASA maintains strict protocols to prevent biological contamination of other planets, not primarily to protect future scientific experiments, but because of a genuine philosophical question about what we owe to potential life forms we have never encountered. If microbial life exists on Mars, do we have obligations toward it? Kant's framework, treat all rational or living beings as ends in themselves, is the philosophical basis for taking that question seriously, and existentialism becomes practical on long-duration missions. Astronauts spending 6 months to a year on the International Space Station report confronting questions of meaning, isolation, and mortality with unusual clarity. The psychological preparation now includes frameworks drawn directly from existentialist philosophy: how to find meaning in a confined environment, how to relate authentically to people you cannot leave, how to face the genuine risk of not returning. War is the place where moral philosophy faces its hardest test, because in war, the ordinary rules of ethics, do not kill, do not destroy, do not deceive, are suspended or inverted, and the question of what replaces them is not administrative, it is philosophical. Just war theory is the tradition that tries to answer that question. It has roots in Augustine, was systematized by Aquinas, developed through the Renaissance by scholars like Francisco de Vitoria and Hugo Grotius, and eventually became the philosophical foundation of modern international humanitarian law. It works in 2 stages. First is jus ad bellum, the justice of going to war at all. A war is just only if it has a just cause, is declared by a legitimate authority, is undertaken as a last resort, has a reasonable chance of success, and uses force proportional to the goal. These are not legal checkboxes. They are philosophical criteria, and reasonable people applying them to the same conflict often reach different conclusions. The second is jus in bello, justice in the conduct of war. Even a just war must be fought within limits. Combatants cannot be deliberately targeted. Prisoners must be treated humanely. Means of warfare that cause unnecessary suffering are prohibited. The Geneva Conventions are the legal codification of these philosophical principles. The Nuremberg trials established something that just war theory had long argued, but that international law had never formally confirmed: that following orders is not a moral defense. Personal responsibility cannot be delegated to authority. That is a Kantian conclusion, arrived at through one of the darkest chapters in human history. The newest challenge is autonomous weapons systems that make lethal decisions without human oversight. When a machine kills, where does moral responsibility reside? Just war theory has no clean answer yet. Philosophy is sometimes described as the discipline that hands its solved problems to other fields and keeps the unsolved ones for itself. Mathematics was once philosophy. Physics was once philosophy. Psychology was once philosophy, but they came independent when their questions became tractable enough for formal methods and empirical testing. What philosophy keeps are the questions that resist that treatment, the ones that remain genuinely open, not because we lack data, but because we lack the conceptual framework to know what data would even be relevant. Right now, in 2025, those questions are multiplying faster than at any point in recent memory. And the reason is that technology is making them urgent in ways they have never been before. Philosophy of mind, which spent decades as a relatively quiet academic debate about consciousness and mental states, is now the philosophical foundation of a trillion-dollar industry trying to build artificial minds. The ethics of distribution and justice, which Rawls spent his career developing, is now being applied to algorithmic systems that make decisions about who gets loans, who gets bail, who gets hired. The philosophy of knowledge, which Hume and Kant wrestled with in the 18th century, is now central to debates about misinformation, epistemic bubbles, and what it means to know something in an environment designed to manipulate belief. Philosophy is also becoming more empirical. The experimental philosophy movement, which began in the early 2000s, uses surveys, behavioral experiments, and neuroimaging to test whether the intuitions that philosophical thought experiments rely on are actually universal or whether they vary across cultures. A study involving 40 million decisions across 233 countries found significant variation in moral intuitions about harm and fairness. That has consequences for every ethical framework built on the assumption of universal moral intuitions. The field is not running out of questions, it is accumulating them. Of all the unsolved problems in philosophy, this is the one that sits closest to everything else, because it is a question about you, specifically, right now, lying in the dark, aware that you are aware. David Chalmers drew a distinction in 1995 that clarified what makes this problem so resistant. There are what he called the easy problems of consciousness, explaining how the brain integrates information, directs attention, controls behavior, produces language. These are genuinely difficult scientific problems, but they are, in principle, solvable. You explain the mechanism, you have explained the phenomenon. The hard problem is different. Even if you had a complete account of every neuron firing in your brain right now, every electrochemical signal, every synaptic connection, every millisecond of neural activity, that account would still not explain why any of it is accompanied by experience, why there is something it is like to be you, rather than all of this processing simply happening in the dark with nobody home. Think about that for a second. The redness of red, the specific quality of this moment, lying here, half asleep, the weight of the blanket, the particular texture of your own tiredness. None of that is captured by a description of neural firing patterns, however complete. The description and the experience are not the same kind of thing. Thomas Nagel made this vivid in a 1974 essay asking what it is like to be a bat. A bat navigates by echolocation. It perceives the world through sound in a way that has no equivalent in human experience. You can describe the neuroscience of bat echolocation in complete detail and still not know what it is like to experience the world that way. Nobody knows why physical processes produce subjective experience. This is not a gap that more neuroscience will automatically close. It may require something conceptually new. The question of moral consideration, what kinds of beings deserve to have their interests taken seriously, has been expanding for the entirety of philosophical history. It started with propertied men. It expanded slowly and painfully to all humans regardless of sex, race, or status. Peter Singer argued in the 1970s that it should expand further still to any being capable of suffering, regardless of species. The criterion is not rationality, not language, not social participation. It is sentience, the capacity to experience pain and well-being. Now the question is arriving at a new threshold, and it is not comfortable. The system exhibits behavior that, in a biological organism, we would associate with preference, aversion, and something like distress. Do we have any obligation toward it? The honest philosophical answer is that we do not know, and that not knowing is itself a moral problem. The frameworks we have give different answers. Kant's criterion is rational agency, the capacity to act according to principles, to treat others as ends. Whether current AI systems meet that criterion is genuinely unclear. Singer's criterion is suffering, and whether AI systems suffer is a question that neuroscience cannot currently answer, because we do not understand what generates suffering even in systems we know are conscious. What is clear is that the question is no longer hypothetical. AI systems are making decisions that affect millions of people. They are being designed with goals, constraints, and something that functions like preference. Philosophical frameworks being used to govern them, the AI ethics boards, the alignment research, the regulatory frameworks emerging in Europe and elsewhere draw directly on Kant, Rawls, and virtue ethics. Philosophy built the tools. Now it is being asked to apply them to entities it never anticipated. The strangest discovery in the history of science is that at the smallest scales of reality, the world does not behave like a world. Particles exist in superposition, meaning multiple states simultaneously until something interacts with them, at which point they resolve into a single definite state. The act of measurement appears to affect what is measured. Physicists have been arguing about what this means for a century, and the arguments are philosophical before they are technical, because they are arguments about the nature of reality itself. The Copenhagen interpretation, associated with Niels Bohr, says do not ask what is happening before measurement. All we can access is the result of measurement, and speculation beyond that is meaningless. This is a deeply Kantian position. We can only know the world as it appears to us through the structures of our observation, not as it is in itself. Many worlds' interpretation says the wave function never collapses. Every quantum event produces branching realities, and all outcomes occur in different branches simultaneously. There is no randomness. There is only a vast, constantly ramifying structure of everything that can happen happening. Think about that for a second. Parmenides argued that reality is eternal, unchanging being, and that change is illusion. Heraclitus argued that everything flows and flux is fundamental. Quantum mechanics has not resolved that argument. It has restated it in mathematical language and made it stranger. The philosophy of physics is an active field precisely because the interpretation of quantum mechanics cannot be settled by more experiments alone. It requires conceptual work, the kind philosophy has always done. For most of its institutional history, academic philosophy in the West treated its own tradition as the tradition, the default, the standard, the thing simply called philosophy, while everything else required a geographical qualifier. Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, African philosophy, as if Athens were the center and everywhere else were the periphery. That assumption is being dismantled, slowly, incompletely, but genuinely. Philosophical traditions we covered in the earliest sections of this conversation, the Vedic tradition, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, are not historical curiosities. They are living intellectual traditions with sophisticated responses to questions that Western philosophy is still wrestling with. Buddhist philosophy of mind has contributions to make to the hard problem of consciousness that analytic philosophy of mind is only beginning to seriously engage. Confucian role ethics offers a genuine alternative to both utilitarian and Kantian frameworks for thinking about obligation and relationship. Ubuntu philosophy, the Southern African tradition whose central insight is that personhood is fundamentally relational, that a person is a person through other persons, offers a direct challenge to the individualist assumptions embedded in most Western political philosophy. In 2016, philosophers Jay Garfield and Brian Van Norden published an essay in the New York Times arguing that if philosophy departments will not seriously engage non-Western traditions, they should rename themselves departments of Western philosophy. The response was significant. The conversation has not stopped. The history of philosophy was always global. The academy is catching up. Philosophy has traditionally worked by constructing thought experiments and testing them against intuition. Would you pull the lever to divert the trolley? Does the Gettier case count as knowledge? Is the Chinese room conscious? The assumption was that these intuitions, while not infallible, are roughly universal, that they reflect something stable about human moral and conceptual thinking. Experimental philosophy asked a simple question: what if that assumption is wrong? Beginning in the early 2000s, philosophers Joshua Knobe and Sean Nichols began testing philosophical intuitions, empirically running surveys across different populations, different cultures, different social backgrounds, to see whether the intuitions that thought experiments rely on are actually shared. The results were unsettling in productive ways. Responses to trolley problems vary significantly between East Asian and Western populations. Intuitions about free will shift depending on how the question is framed. Moral judgments about identical actions change based on whether harm is described as a means or a side effect. The largest study of its kind, the Moral Machine Experiment, run by MIT in 2018, collected 40 million moral decisions from people in 233 countries and found substantial cross-cultural variation in how people weigh competing harms. What this means for philosophy is genuinely contested. One view is that variable intuitions undermine the thought experiments built on them. Another is that the variation itself is philosophically interesting. That mapping where intuitions diverge tells us something important about the structure of moral thinking that pure armchair reasoning never could. Either way, philosophy now has data it did not have before. The last frontier philosophy is approaching is also the most intimate. Not the cosmos, not society, not other minds, but your own mind directly from the inside. Brain-computer interfaces are no longer science fiction. Neuralink began human trials in 2024. Systems already exist that allow paralyzed individuals to control computers and robotic limbs through thought alone. The technology is moving faster than the ethical frameworks designed to govern it. The philosophical questions it raises are ones no previous generation has had to seriously consider. If a device reads your neural activity continuously, who owns that data? Your thoughts, before they become words or actions, are currently the one thing that remains entirely private. The moment they become readable, that changes. Until privacy, the philosophical principle that your inner life belongs to you in a way that nothing else does becomes a practical, legal, and ethical question rather than an abstract one. Cognitive enhancement raises the virtue ethics problem directly. Aristotle argued that virtue must be earned through practice, that the character you build by repeatedly choosing well is genuinely yours in a way that a shortcut cannot replicate. If a drug or an implant makes you more patient, more focused, more resistant to fear, is that virtue? Or is it a simulation of virtue that bypasses the process that makes virtue meaningful? And memory modification, already possible in rudimentary form in animal models, asks what we owe our own past. If you could remove a painful memory, should you? Your past self lived through that experience. What gives your present self the right to erase it? These questions are arriving. Philosophy is the only discipline equipped to ask them properly. Before the close, it is worth sitting for a moment with the questions that remain genuinely open, not as failures of philosophy, but as evidence of its honesty. These are the places where human thought has pushed as far as it can and found, not a wall, but an edge, something that keeps receding as you approach it. The hard problem of consciousness. Why is there subjective experience at all? Why is there something it is like to be you, rather than just processing happening in the dark? The problem of free will. Are you genuinely the author of your choices, or is every decision the inevitable product of prior causes, neurons, genes, history that you did not choose? If determinism is true, what does responsibility even mean? The problem of induction. Why does the future resemble the past? You have never experienced tomorrow. Every scientific prediction rests on an assumption that cannot itself be scientifically proven. Foundations of mathematics. Are mathematical truths discovered or invented? Gödel proved in 1931 that any sufficiently powerful mathematical system contains true statements that cannot be proven within that system. The implications have never been fully absorbed. The Izot gap. How do you get from facts about the world to obligations about what should be done? No description of what is has ever logically entailed what ought to be. Hume identified this gap in the 18th century, and it has never been closed. These questions are not embarrassments. They are the horizon. Every generation of philosophers walks toward them, gets a little closer, and finds they have moved again. 2,600 years. Every continent, dozens of languages, traditions that never knew each other existed, arriving independently at the same questions. What is real? What can we know? How should we live? Nobody has finished answering them. That is not a failure. It is the nature of the questions. They are not the kind that get answered and retired. They are the kind that each generation inherits, works on, and passes forward, slightly changed, slightly deepened, to the next. Think about what that thread actually is. The Vedic sages passing their questions through oral memory for centuries before writing existed. Confucius dying disappointed, knowing that 2,000 years of civilization would be shaped by what he could not get any ruler to listen to. Socrates calm in a prison cell, still talking, right up until the hemlock made talking impossible. Varro's writing commentaries in Sierra Doba that would travel across the Mediterranean and wake up a tradition that had forgotten half of what it knew. Kant walking the same route every day in Königsberg, never leaving, building a revolution in how the human mind understands itself. Wittgenstein giving away a fortune, teaching children in a village, dismantling his own ideas with the same rigor he applied to everyone else's. Rawls sitting down after a world war and asking, what would a just society look like if nobody knew what position they would occupy in it? These people did not know each other. They lived centuries apart, spoke different languages, held incompatible views, and they were all working on the same thing. So are you. Every question you carry about what is real, what is right, what any of this means, you did not invent those questions. You inherited them, and somewhere ahead, someone you will never meet will inherit them from you. The questions have not been answered, but they have been kept alive by every person who ever lay awake at night wondering, and that includes you, right now, exactly as you are.